Imagine two people sitting at a desk right now. One of them is in a college library, surrounded by highlighters, three textbooks open, a latte getting cold beside a spiral notebook filled with color-coded notes. She's been studying for 4 hours. She feels productive. She looks productive. She'll tell you she understands the material. The other person is in a prison cell. No internet, no tutor, no structured curriculum. A single book, a pencil worn down to a nub, and something burning quietly inside him that most people in that library have never felt. 6 months later, the person in the prison cell can explain what he learned with a clarity that would make a professor pause. The person in the library? She passed the exam and then forgot almost everything by Tuesday. Now, before you get defensive, I'm not romanticizing incarceration. I'm not suggesting prison is a university. What I am saying is that something happens inside certain constrained, high-stakes, stripped-down environments that almost never happens inside comfortable, well-resourced ones. And understanding why that happens might be the most important thing you learn today. Because the gap between those two people isn't about intelligence. It isn't about willpower. It isn't even really about circumstances. It's about something much quieter, much more invisible. It's about what learning actually is versus what most of us have been performing our entire lives. Section 1. The Illusion of Competence. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you truly didn't understand something? Not the feeling of not having read it yet, not the sensation of needing to review your notes. I mean the genuine, slightly uncomfortable, ego-deflating experience of sitting with an idea and realizing, I actually have no idea what this means. Most people haven't felt that in years, and that's a problem. Because here's what's actually happening when most students study. They read a passage, the words are familiar, the sentences flow. They feel a warm current of recognition. Oh yes, I've heard of that. I know what that means. And they move on. They highlight the sentence. Maybe they write it down. And that act of writing, of highlighting, of rereading, it creates a sensation, a feeling that can only be described as knowing. Psychologists call this the fluency illusion. The idea is devastatingly simple. When information feels easy to process, we mistake that ease for understanding. We confuse the recognition of words with the comprehension of ideas. Robert Bjork at UCLA has spent decades studying this. He calls it one of the most persistent and damaging errors in human learning. We are, it turns out, spectacularly bad at knowing what we actually know. And the system we've built around education, it makes it worse. Think about it. Most academic environments reward performance of understanding. Essays that sound smart, exams that test recall, presentations that look polished. The feedback loop is designed around appearing competent, not becoming competent. So students, quite rationally, optimize for appearance. They highlight, they summarize, they reread, they make beautiful notes, they attend lectures, they do all the things that look like learning, and then they wonder why 3 weeks later the knowledge has evaporated like morning mist. This isn't laziness, it's a completely logical response to a broken feedback system. Now compare that to what happens in a very different environment. Someone with no external validation, no grade at the end, no tutor nodding approvingly, no peers to compare notes with, just a person alone with an idea and a kind of desperate intellectual hunger that comes from having very little else. In that environment, you can't perform understanding. There's no audience, there's no rubric, there's only you and the material. And when you don't understand something, you feel it immediately, because there's nothing covering it up. That rawness, that exposure, that's where real learning begins.
Section 2. The Psychology of Discomfort and What It Really Means. Here's something most people don't tell you about learning. Confusion is not a sign that something is wrong. Confusion is a sign that your brain is working. When Richard Feynman, the physicist, the Nobel laureate, the man who could explain quantum electrodynamics to a 12-year-old, when Feynman sat with a problem, he wasn't trying to eliminate confusion quickly. He was following it. He was curious about it. He treated confusion the way a detective treats a locked door, not as a dead end, but as a clue that something interesting was on the other side. He once said something that sounds almost counterintuitive until you think about it slowly. He said that the first step to understanding anything is to be willing to admit you don't understand it. That sounds simple. It is not simple. Because admitting you don't understand something costs you something. It costs you ego. And ego, it turns out, is one of the single greatest obstacles to human learning that has ever existed. Think about what happens when a college student encounters something confusing in a lecture. The internal monologue, and I want you to recognize yourself in this because most of us have been here, the internal monologue goes something like, I should understand this. Everyone else seems to get it. If I ask a question, they'll know I'm lost. I'll write it down and figure it out later. And then later never comes. Or it comes and they read it again and the confusion is still there, but now there's an exam tomorrow and the confusion gets buried under a layer of memorized definitions. That buried confusion, it doesn't go away. It becomes a structural weakness, a gap in the foundation. And the taller the building of knowledge you try to construct on top of it, the more dangerous that gap becomes. Now think about what happens when someone has no social performance to maintain, when there is no classroom, no judgment, no appearance to uphold, when there is only the problem and the silence. They sit with the confusion longer, not because they're more disciplined, not because they're smarter, but because there's nothing else to do. And in that extended sitting, something extraordinary begins to happen. The brain, left alone with a problem long enough, starts to negotiate with it. It starts asking questions, simple ones at first. What does this word actually mean? Where does this idea come from? What would happen if the opposite were true? And those questions, those naive, childlike, ego-free questions, those are the ones that crack things open. Let me teach you something. Not a study hack, not a productivity tip, something deeper. Feynman had a method. It's been called the Feynman technique, and most people reduce it to this: explain things simply. And that's true, but it misses the spiritual core of what he was actually doing. Here's the real version. Take any concept you think you understand. Doesn't matter what it is. Could be the French Revolution, could be photosynthesis, could be why your last relationship ended, could be how compound interest works. Now, try to explain it. Not to an expert, not to a peer, to a 10-year-old. Not because 10-year-olds are unintelligent, quite the opposite, but because a 10-year-old will not allow you to hide behind jargon. A 10-year-old will look at you and say, but why, at exactly the moment you were hoping they wouldn't, at the moment your understanding ends and your impression of understanding begins. When you try to explain something simply and you find yourself stumbling, when you reach for a technical term to fill a gap, when you say, it's complicated or you just have to trust me, that stumble is not embarrassment. That is diagnostic information. It is your brain in real time showing you exactly where the gap is. And here's the critical part. Most people, when they hit that stumble, they feel shame. They stop. They decide they're not smart enough. They go back to the textbook and reread the same paragraph they already read twice. Feynman did something different. He got interested. He thought, oh, that's where I don't actually understand it. Fascinating. Let me go there. That reframe from shame to curiosity is one of the most powerful psychological pivots a human being can make, and it's available to anyone at any moment in any circumstance, including a prison cell. There's a famous pattern among people who have transformed their intellectual lives during incarceration. Malcolm X is perhaps the most well-documented. He describes copying the dictionary by hand, not to memorize words, but because he wanted to understand the architecture of language. He wanted to own it, not merely use it. He didn't have a professor grading him. He didn't have a deadline. He had an internal hunger that external comfort tends to quietly suffocate. And so he learned by teaching himself. which it turns out is the most rigorous form of learning there is. Because when you have to teach yourself, you cannot fake it. The gap between what you think you understand and what you actually understand becomes brutally visible. And that visibility, as uncomfortable as it is exactly the condition under which real knowledge is built.
Section 4. The Identity Trap, and Why Smart People Learn Less. Here's something that might bother you. The smarter you think you are, the harder it is to learn. Not because intelligence is a liability, but because the identity of being smart is. When your self-worth is tied to being the person who understands things quickly, when you've built a reputation, even just internally, as someone who gets it, the act of not understanding becomes threatening. It's not just confusion, it's an identity crisis. And so you protect yourself, unconsciously, elegantly. You skim rather than read deeply. You nod along in conversations you don't fully follow. You use complex language to mask gaps in thinking. You surround yourself with people slightly less informed than you, so that your competence always looks relative. These are not the behaviors of a lazy person. These are the behaviors of a person who has mistaken their intelligence for a fixed thing that must be defended, rather than a living thing that must be exercised. Carol Dweck spent years studying this. She calls it a fixed mindset, and she found something haunting. Students who are praised for being smart, as opposed to being praised for effort or curiosity, those students, when faced with a challenge, disengage. They choose easier problems. They cheat more often. They give up sooner. Because failure for them isn't information, it's an indictment. Now consider someone who doesn't have a smart person identity to protect. Someone who has, perhaps through circumstances that had nothing to do with learning, been told that they aren't intelligent, that education wasn't for them, that thinking deeply wasn't their domain. In an odd way, and I want to say this carefully, that person sometimes has a kind of intellectual freedom that their credentialed counterparts don't. They have nothing to protect, so they ask the basic question without shame. They sit with the confusion without ego. They read the same page 7 times without feeling like that's evidence of their inadequacy. And in that freedom from the prison of identity, paradoxically, they learn faster. The constraint of circumstance strips away the noise, and what's left, sometimes, is the pure signal of genuine curiosity. So what does this mean for you? Not as an abstract idea, but right now, in your actual life. Here's what I believe. The quality of your thinking is not determined by your IQ or your degree or the prestige of the institution you attended. It is determined almost entirely by your willingness to be wrong, your willingness to be confused, your willingness to feel stupid in the service of becoming less stupid. That willingness is a choice, a daily one, and it costs something every time you make it. It costs the comfortable feeling of already knowing. It costs the social approval of looking like you have it together. It costs the identity that says you're already intelligent enough. But what you get in return is something much rarer, actual understanding. The kind that doesn't evaporate after the exam, the kind that connects across domains, the kind that when someone pushes on it, it doesn't collapse, it deepens, because it was built on genuine engagement, not borrowed language. When Feynman was asked once whether it bothered him not to know the answer to something, he said something I think about often. He said that not knowing was exciting, that uncertainty was not a problem waiting to be solved, it was a place worth living in for a while. That is a fundamentally different relationship with knowledge than what most of us were taught. We were taught that the goal is to arrive, to know, to be certain. Feynman and the quiet, stripped-down learner in that cell, and the great thinkers throughout history, they understood something else, that the goal is to travel,
to keep asking, to remain slightly unsettled by the world, because a settled mind is a stopped one. And here's where this gets personal, because I think most people who are struggling to learn something right now, struggling to understand their work, their relationships, themselves, the problem isn't that they lack information. The problem is that they've stopped asking the honest questions, the ones that feel naive, the ones that feel embarrassing, the ones that start with, "But wait, do I actually understand why?" Those questions are not signs of weakness. They are the precise mechanism through which intelligence grows. Not the intelligence you were born with, but the intelligence you build through honesty, through discomfort, through the willingness to say, clearly and without shame, "I don't know yet."
I want to leave you with something. Not a 5-step system, not a challenge to post in the comments, just a thought to carry with you quietly. The difference between the person who transforms their mind and the person who merely accumulates information is not talent, it's not access, it's not even time. It's a single, recurring willingness. The willingness to stop looking like you understand and to start becoming someone who does. That shift is small, almost invisible from the outside, but inside it changes everything. The way you read, the way you listen, the way you sit with a problem that doesn't have an easy answer. It changes what you're actually doing when you call something learning. So here's the question I want you to hold. Not answer, just hold. What is one thing you believe you understand that you've never actually tried to explain from scratch, in simple words, with no notes, to someone who would ask you why? Don't look it up. Don't reach for the textbook. Just sit with the question. Notice what happens in that silence. Because that silence, that slight discomfort, that small reaching toward the edge of what you actually know, that's not ignorance, that's the beginning.